He thought losing the ability to walk was the worst thing that could happen to him, but tonight, he was about to learn what true abandonment feels like. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, crystal chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors that cost more than most people's homes, and every table was filled with quiet conversations, soft laughter, and the clink of fine glassware, the kind of place where power didn't need to announce itself because it was already understood, and at the center of it all sat Adrian Volkov, once the most feared man in the city, now confined to a wheelchair that gleamed almost as much as the reputation. He used to carry effortlessly, his tailored charcoal suit still perfect, his posture still commanding, but something in the room had shifted, something subtle yet undeniable, as if the air itself no longer bent around him the way it used to, and across from him sat a woman who had spent the entire evening glancing not at him, but at the exit, her fingers tapping impatiently against the table as though counting down to something only she could see, her voice sharp when she finally spoke, cutting clean through the illusion of normalcy they had both been pretending to maintain. "I didn't sign up for this," she said, her tone low but not low enough, not when silence in a place like this could amplify even a whisper into a spectacle, and Adrian didn't respond, not immediately, his eyes steady, unreadable, as if he had already heard those words 100 times before in different voices, different rooms, different moments since the accident, but this time, it wasn't whispered behind closed doors, this time it was public, deliberate, a performance for anyone willing to watch, and she stood up without waiting for an answer, her chair scraping lightly against the marble, the sound small but somehow louder than anything else in the room, and for a brief second, she hesitated, not out of doubt, but calculation, before placing her hand on the back of his wheelchair and nudging it just slightly off alignment with the table, not enough to cause harm, just enough to make a statement, to remind him and everyone else exactly where she believed he now belonged, and then she walked away, heels echoing in a slow, measured rhythm that felt almost rehearsed, leaving behind a space that was heavier than her presence had ever been, and for a moment, no one spoke, but silence in a crowded room is never empty, it fills quickly with glances, with whispers that pretend to be subtle but never are, with the quiet cruelty of people who believe they are simply observing, until one voice, somewhere behind Adrian, broke through with a low chuckle. "Guess power doesn't mean much when you can't stand anymore," and the laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be, because it carried, it spread, it settled into the corners of the room like something permanent, and Adrian remained still, his hands resting calmly on the armrests, his expression unchanged, almost detached, as if the moment existed somewhere outside of him, as if he had already learned to survive this kind of humiliation by stepping away from it entirely. But his eyes, dark and steady, revealed something else, something deeper than anger, something colder than pride, something that had nothing to do with the man he used to be and everything to do with the man he was becoming, and across the room, unnoticed by most, a waitress paused mid-step, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her gaze fixed not on the departing woman, not on the whispering guests, but on him, on the stillness of a man who had just been publicly abandoned and yet refused to collapse under the weight of it, and in that quiet, fragile moment, before anyone else decided what this scene meant, before the room settled into its judgment, she made a choice that would shift everything. The tray in Naomi Carter's hand remained steady, but her heartbeat did not, each pulse echoing louder than the soft jazz drifting through the restaurant as she stood there for half a second too long, watching a man who had just been stripped of something far more fragile than power, and unlike the others, she did not see a fallen king, she saw a man surrounded by noise yet completely alone, a kind of silence she recognized too well, the kind that settles in when people stop seeing you as human and start seeing you as a condition, a burden, a cautionary tale, and something in her chest tightened, not out of pity, but out of quiet defiance, because she had seen that look before, not in a mirror, but in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and long nights, where her father had spent 6 years confined to a bed that slowly became his entire world, where visitors came less often, voices softened with discomfort, and respect faded into something polite and distant, and she remembered how the smallest acts had mattered, not grand gestures, just someone adjusting a blanket without being asked, someone speaking to him instead of around him, someone refusing to treat him like he had already disappeared, and now, standing in a room filled with wealth and polished surfaces, she saw that same quiet erasure happening again, just dressed in finer clothes, And her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray before she made her decision, a simple one on the surface, but one that would draw every eye in the room the moment she acted, and she stepped forward, her shoes silent against the marble as she crossed the distance between herself and Adrian, each step measured, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, as if she had already accepted whatever consequences might follow, and when she reached the table, she did not look at the empty chair across from him. She did not glance at the direction the woman had left, she did not acknowledge the whispers that grew just a little louder as she approached. Instead she focused on him, on the man still sitting upright despite everything, his hands unmoving, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room as though he had already detached from it, and for a moment, she simply stood there, allowing the silence to settle, allowing the weight of her presence to be felt without a single word, before she gently placed the tray down on the edge of the table. The soft sound of porcelain meeting wood cutting through the low hum of conversation like a quiet interruption, and then she reached for a cloth, her movements calm, precise, and without asking permission, she leaned slightly forward and began to wipe the spilled wine from the edge of the table near his hand, not rushing, not making a show of it, just doing what needed to be done as if this moment was no different from any other task she had performed 100 times before, and that was what made it different, because there was no hesitation in her touch, no careful distance, no invisible barrier of discomfort that most people carried when faced with someone in his position. And Adrian noticed, of course he noticed, the subtle shift in the air, the absence of that familiar tension, and his eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, from the reflection on the table to her face, studying her with the same intensity he once used to assess threats and alliances, but this was neither, and that unsettled him in a way he had not expected, because she did not look away, she did not lower her gaze or rush to finish and leave. She simply met his eyes with a steadiness that felt almost out of place in a room like this, and for the first time that evening, something cracked in the controlled stillness he had built around himself, not visibly, not enough for the room to notice, but enough for him to feel it, a shift so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, and yet it was there, undeniable, as the whispers around them softened into something more cautious, more curious, because now the scene had changed, no longer just a man abandoned, but a moment unfolding that no one quite understood yet, and Naomi, still calm, still grounded, finished wiping the last trace of spilled wine before straightening slightly, her voice quiet when she finally spoke, but clear enough to reach him without effort. "You are still being watched," she said, not as a warning, not as sympathy, but as a simple truth, and in that moment, the room did not go silent because of power, it went silent because something real had just entered it. Adrian did not respond right away, not because he did not hear her, but because her words landed somewhere deeper than the noise around them, cutting past the rehearsed indifference he had been wearing all night, and for a brief moment, the version of himself that once controlled rooms with a single glance hesitated, as if recalibrating to a reality where control no longer came from fear or reputation, but from something far more fragile, something he had not relied on in years, and his eyes remained on hers, searching not for weakness, but for motive, because in his world, kindness was rarely without purpose, and yet there was none to be found, no calculation in her posture, no hidden agenda in the way she stood there, steady and unshaken, as though the whispers circling them meant nothing at all, and that unsettled him more than the woman who had just walked out, because rejection he understood, humiliation he could endure, but this quiet refusal to treat him differently, that was unfamiliar, almost disarming, and around them, the room began to shift again, not with laughter this time, but with a different kind of tension, one that comes when people realize a scene has not ended the way they expected, when the narrative they were ready to accept suddenly changes direction, and a man seated 2 tables away leaned slightly toward his companion, his voice low but not low enough. "She is really doing this right now," he murmured, the words carrying just enough to reach the edges of the moment, while another guest shook his head with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes, as if amused by what he assumed was a temporary act of sympathy, and near the bar, the restaurant manager had already begun moving, his steps quick, controlled, the kind of urgency masked as professionalism, because from his perspective, this was not a moment of humanity, it was a disruption, something that needed to be corrected before it became a problem, before it challenged the invisible hierarchy that kept everything in place, and Naomi noticed him approaching long before he reached them, but she did not step back, did not retreat into the safety of invisibility that most people in her position relied on. Instead she remained exactly where she was, her presence quiet but unwavering, and Adrian saw that too. The way she chose to stay when leaving would have been easier, and something in his chest tightened, not with anger, but with recognition, because he knew that choice, he had made it himself once, long before the accident, when standing his ground had been second nature, when power meant never having to second-guess your place in a room, and now, watching her, he realized that kind of strength had nothing to do with whether a man could stand or sit, it came from something else entirely, something that could not be taken by circumstance, and as the manager finally reached their table, his voice polite but firm, carefully balanced between respect for Adrian and authority over Naomi, "Miss Carter," he said, his tone measured, "I am going to need you to step away from this table," and the words hung there, not aggressive, but unmistakably final, an attempt to restore order without drawing more attention, and for a split second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see how this would resolve, expecting compliance, expecting the moment to fold back into normalcy, but Naomi did not move, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if the instruction had passed through her without weight, and Adrian felt it then, the shift he could no longer ignore, the subtle turning of something inside him that had been dormant since the day everything changed, and before the manager could speak again, before the whispers could grow louder, before the moment could be taken out of their hands, Adrian's voice broke through the tension, low, controlled, and unmistakably clear. "She stays," he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a certainty that did not ask for permission, and in that instant, the room went completely still, because for the first time that night, the man everyone thought had lost his power had just reminded them that it had never really left, it had only changed form. The manager froze for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the weight of Adrian's words to settle into the air, and in a place where status dictated every interaction, that single sentence shifted the balance in a way no one could ignore, his polite expression tightening ever so slightly as he recalculated the situation, because this was no longer about a waitress stepping out of line. This was about a man whose influence still reached far beyond the boundaries of a dining room, and Naomi felt the tension change around her, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that comes when a room realizes it may have misjudged who holds authority, and yet she did not step back, did not soften her stance, because she had not stayed for his power, she had stayed for him, and Adrian noticed that distinction, the absence of immediate relief or gratitude. The lack of that subtle shift people often displayed when aligning themselves with strength, and instead she remained steady, grounded in something that did not depend on him at all, and that unsettled him in a different way, because for years, loyalty had always come with expectation, with silent negotiations and invisible contracts, but this felt different, cleaner, almost unfamiliar, and the manager cleared his throat quietly, forcing a composed smile that did not quite mask the discomfort beneath it. "Of course, sir," he said, his voice smoother now, carefully adjusted, "we only aim to maintain the atmosphere for all guests," and the words were chosen with precision, neutral enough to retreat without appearing to yield, but the shift had already happened, and everyone in the room could feel it. The whispers had changed again, no longer mocking, no longer amused, but cautious, observant, as if each person was suddenly aware that they might have misread the situation entirely, and a woman near the bar lowered her glass slowly, her eyes fixed on Adrian with a new kind of curiosity, while the man who had laughed earlier now looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in anything but the scene unfolding, and Naomi, still standing beside Adrian, reached for the water glass on the table, her movements calm and deliberate, refilling it without asking, without ceremony, as if the moment of tension had never existed, and that simple act carried more weight than anything said aloud, because it stripped the situation of spectacle, reducing it back to something human, something ordinary, and Adrian watched her, not the room, not the manager stepping away, but her, the quiet rhythm of her actions, the way she moved without hesitation, without seeking approval, and something in him shifted. Again, deeper this time, because he realized she was not trying to fix what had happened, she was not trying to restore his dignity, she was simply refusing to let it be taken in the first place, and that realization landed heavier than any insult he had endured that night, and when she finally spoke again, her voice soft but steady, it did not carry sympathy, it carried truth. "You are still here," she said, Her eyes meeting his once more, and that is not something people know how to handle. And Adrian exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, as if her words had given shape to something he had been feeling but could not define, and for the first time since the accident, since the endless meetings and polite conversations and carefully managed appearances, he felt something unfamiliar settle into place, not control, not dominance, but clarity, and his gaze sharpened slightly, not with the cold calculation the room expected, but with something quieter, more deliberate, as if he was seeing not just her, but the moment itself with new understanding, and the silence that followed was different now, no longer heavy with judgment, but charged with anticipation, because something had changed in a way no one could quite explain, and every person in that room could feel it, even if they did not yet understand what it meant. Adrian's fingers shifted slightly against the armrest, not out of discomfort, but as if grounding himself in the present moment, the polished wood beneath his hand cool and real in a way that the past few minutes had not been, and he studied Naomi with a focus that no longer carried suspicion, but something closer to recognition, as if he had finally identified the difference between someone who stayed out of obligation and someone who stayed out of choice, and that distinction mattered more than anything else in that room, because power had always ensured presence, but it had never guaranteed sincerity, and now, stripped of the illusion that came with status, he could see that clearly for the first time, and Naomi did not rush to fill the silence that followed her words, she allowed it to breathe, to settle naturally instead of forcing meaning into it, her posture relaxed but intentional, as if she understood that moments like this could not be pushed, they had to unfold on their own terms, and around them, the restaurant had resumed its quiet rhythm, but not fully, there was still a subtle pull in the atmosphere, a lingering awareness that something significant had shifted, conversations softer than before, glances more deliberate, as if people were careful now, cautious about how they observed, how they reacted. Because whatever had just happened had not followed the script they were used to, and Adrian noticed that too, the way the room adjusted itself around him once again, not entirely, not the way it had before, but enough to remind him that influence was not gone, it had simply changed shape, and his gaze flickered briefly toward the empty chair across from him, the absence no longer sharp, no longer defining, just a space that had been cleared of something that no longer belonged there, and when he looked back at Naomi, there was a quiet shift in his expression, not softer, but more present, more engaged, as if he had stepped fully back into the moment instead of observing it from a distance, and his voice, when he finally spoke again, carried that same controlled steadiness, but without the edge it once held. "What is your name?" he asked, not as a formality, but as a question that mattered. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her answer simple, unembellished, "Naomi Carter." She said, her tone even, neither deferential nor defensive, just honest, and Adrian repeated it once under his breath, as if testing its weight, committing it to memory in a way that suggested this was not a passing interaction, and for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible crossed his face, not a smile, not quite, but something close enough to change the air between them, and Naomi noticed it, not because it was obvious, but because she had learned to recognize small shifts in people long before they became visible to others, and she turned slightly, reaching for the folded menu still resting untouched on the table, placing it in front of him with a quiet efficiency that felt grounding. Returning the situation to something familiar, something structured, "The kitchen is still open," she said calmly, "if you would like to order," and the simplicity of the statement carried an unexpected weight, because it reframed everything, not as a scene, not as an incident, but as a continuation, as if the night had not ended with humiliation, but had simply changed direction, and Adrian let out a slow breath. The tension that had settled into his shoulders easing just slightly, not disappearing, but loosening enough to allow something else to take its place, and as he looked at the menu, then back at her, there was a quiet understanding forming, one that did not need to be spoken aloud, that this moment, this unexpected intersection between two completely different worlds, was not something either of them had planned, but it was something neither of them was walking away from either, and in that stillness, with the soft glow of the chandelier above casting light across the table, the narrative of the night shifted once more, no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what had just begun. Adrian's gaze lingered on the menu for only a moment before drifting back to Naomi, as if the printed words in front of him carried less weight than the quiet certainty standing beside his table, and that alone was enough to shift something deeper inside him, because for years decisions had come easily, meals chosen without thought, conversations controlled without effort, but now even the smallest choices felt different, not harder, but more deliberate, as if every action required him to be present in a way he had never needed before, and Naomi noticed the pause, not as hesitation, but as transition, the kind that happens when someone is learning how to exist again under new conditions, and she did not rush him, did not fill the silence with suggestions or rehearsed recommendations, she simply waited, her posture calm, her presence steady, offering space instead of direction, and that, more than anything, grounded him, because it allowed him to choose instead of react, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet clarity that had been missing earlier in the night. "What do you recommend?" he asked, not out of uncertainty, but as an invitation, a subtle shift from command to conversation, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering him for a brief second, not evaluating his status, but reading something far more human, his mood, the weight of the evening still resting on his shoulders, the quiet exhaustion behind his composure, and her answer came without hesitation. "Simple but intentional, something warm," she said, her tone soft but assured. "Something that reminds you the night is not over yet," and the words were not dramatic, not designed to impress, but they carried a kind of quiet understanding that settled into the space between them, and Adrian exhaled again, slower this time, as if that single suggestion had given him more than just a meal, it had given him direction, and he nodded once, a small gesture, but one that felt more significant than any decision he had made all evening, and Naomi turned smoothly, retrieving her notepad, writing the order with practiced ease before stepping away, her movement fluid, unhurried, leaving behind a space that no longer felt empty, but held something new, something that lingered even in her absence, and as she moved through the restaurant, the subtle shift in the room followed her, eyes tracking her path not with judgment now, but with curiosity, because what had just unfolded at that table had rewritten the expectations of everyone watching, and near the bar, the manager stood still for a moment longer than necessary, his earlier confidence replaced with a careful restraint, as if he understood that whatever line had been crossed could not simply be redrawn, and Adrian remained at the table, his hands resting where they had been, but his posture different now, not because his body had changed, but because something in his presence had, the weight of humiliation no longer defining the moment, replaced instead by a quiet, controlled awareness that he had not lost what mattered, he had simply been forced to see it differently, and as he glanced once more toward the empty chair across from him, it no longer felt like absence, it felt like space, space that had been cleared for something that had not yet fully taken shape, and when Naomi returned minutes later, carrying a single dish that released a subtle warmth into the air, she placed it in front of him with the same calm precision, her eyes meeting his briefly, not to seek approval, but to acknowledge the moment they now shared, and Adrian looked down at the plate, then back at her, and for the first time that night, there was no trace of distance in his expression, only presence, as if he had finally stepped fully into a moment that had been waiting for him all along, and around them, the restaurant continued, but something had changed permanently, something no one in that room would forget, even if they could not yet put it into words. The warmth from the dish rose slowly into the air, subtle but steady, carrying with it a quiet contrast to the tension that had filled the table not long before, and Adrian looked at it for a moment longer than necessary, not because he was unsure, but because the act of simply continuing felt unfamiliar, almost foreign after everything that had unfolded, and yet there it was. Something ordinary placed in front of him like an invitation to step forward instead of remain in the shadow of what had already passed, and when he finally reached for the utensil, his movement was controlled, deliberate, not rushed, as though reclaiming something that had nothing to do with the meal itself, but everything to do with presence, and Naomi remained nearby, not hovering, not retreating completely, but positioned in that precise distance where she could be available without intruding, a balance that spoke of experience, of understanding boundaries that most people never learn to recognize, and as Adrian took the first bite, the room seemed to exhale in a way no one consciously noticed, the subtle release of anticipation as the moment transitioned from spectacle back into something quieter, something more grounded, but not entirely forgotten, because the eyes were still there, the awareness still lingering just beneath the surface, and at a table across the room, the woman who had left earlier had not gone far. She stood near the entrance now, her posture tense, her gaze fixed on Adrian with a mixture of disbelief and something less defined, something closer to regret than she would ever admit, and she watched as Naomi moved with calm assurance, as Adrian remained composed, as the narrative she had tried to close simply continued without her, and that realization sat heavily in her expression, because she had expected the moment to end with her exit, not to evolve in her absence, and the contrast between expectation and reality was becoming impossible to ignore, and Adrian felt it too, the shift behind him, the presence of someone who had not fully left, but he did not turn, not immediately, because for the first time that night, his focus was not on what had walked away, it was on what had stayed, and Naomi noticed the slight change in his posture, the subtle awareness without reaction, and she followed his line of silence rather than his line of sight, understanding without needing confirmation, and she said nothing. Because not every truth needed to be spoken aloud, and that restraint carried more weight than any commentary could have, and after a moment, Adrian set the utensil down briefly, his gaze lifting to meet Naomi's again, not searching this time, not questioning, but acknowledging something that had already been established, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but no less certain. "You did not have to do this," he said. The words simple, but layered with meaning that extended far beyond the table, and Naomi held his gaze for a second before responding, her expression unchanged, her tone calm. "I know," she said, and that was all, no explanation, no justification, just truth, and the simplicity of it settled into the moment like something final, something that could not be undone or reframed, and Adrian absorbed it in silence, because there was nothing to challenge, nothing to question, only something to understand, and behind him, the faint sound of footsteps hesitated. Near the edge of the dining room, uncertain, almost out of place now, as if the person approaching no longer held the same position they once believed they did, and the room felt it again, that subtle tightening of attention, that quiet anticipation of what might come next, but this time, the center of it was no longer defined by loss or humiliation, it was defined by something far more controlled, far more deliberate, and Adrian remained exactly where he was, steady, composed, no longer reacting to the room, but allowing the room to adjust to him, and Naomi, standing beside him, did not move either, her presence unchanged, her calm unwavering, as if she had already decided that whatever came next, she was not stepping away from this moment. The soft echo of those hesitant footsteps finally reached the table, and this time Adrian did not need to turn to know who it was. The presence carried a different kind of weight now, not the sharp confidence from earlier, but something quieter, uncertain, as if each step toward him required more effort than the last, and the woman who had once walked away without hesitation now stood just a few feet behind him, caught between pride and something she could no longer fully control, and the room felt it immediately, the shift in energy, the subtle tightening of attention as conversations slowed once again, eyes lifting carefully, discreetly, as though no one wanted to be obvious but everyone wanted to witness what would happen next, and Naomi sensed it too, the return of the moment that had not quite ended, and yet she did not move, did not step aside or retreat into the background. She remained exactly where she was, her posture calm, her presence grounded, not claiming space, but not surrendering it either, and Adrian continued to face forward for a second longer, finishing the motion of setting his utensil down with the same controlled precision, as if nothing behind him held urgency anymore, and only then did he turn, slowly, deliberately, his gaze meeting the woman who had left him in front of an audience that now watched her just as closely as they had watched him, and for the first time that evening, she did not hold his attention with certainty. There was something else there now, something fractured beneath the surface of her composed expression, and when she spoke, her voice was lower than before, careful, as if choosing each word with more intention than she had earlier. "Adrian, I think we should talk," she said, the sentence simple, but layered with an unspoken attempt to reclaim control of a moment that had already moved beyond her, and Adrian regarded her quietly, not cold, not distant, but different, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time without the distortion of expectation or habit, and he did not respond immediately, allowing the silence to stretch just enough for the imbalance to become visible, for the shift in power to settle into the space between them, and Naomi remained still, her gaze not fixed on either of them, but aware, present, understanding that this was not her moment to speak, but it was her moment to stay, and that distinction mattered, and the woman shifted slightly under the weight of the silence, her eyes flickering briefly toward Naomi, not with open hostility, but with a quiet discomfort, As if she could not quite place what Naomi represented in this moment, not a threat in the traditional sense, but something far more unsettling, something that could not be dismissed or controlled, and Adrian noticed that glance, the brief acknowledgement of someone she had once overlooked entirely, and something in him settled with finality, because in that small, almost invisible exchange, the truth became undeniable, and when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, calm, carrying none of the urgency she had expected. "There is nothing left to discuss," he said, the words clear, not raised, not forceful, but absolute in a way that did not invite argument, and the room seemed to still around them, not because of volume, but because of certainty, because this was no longer a reaction, it was a decision, and the woman blinked, just once, the composure she had maintained beginning to fracture at the edges as the reality of the situation settled in, and for a brief moment, she opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came, because there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reshape, and Adrian did not look away, but he did not linger either, his attention shifting back to the table, to the quiet presence beside him that had never asked for anything, never demanded a place, and yet had become the only constant in a moment defined by change, and Naomi felt that shift without needing to see it, the silent acknowledgement that something had closed and something else had begun, and as the woman slowly stepped back, her footsteps softer this time, almost uncertain, the room released the tension it had been holding, not with sound, but with a collective understanding that what had just happened could not be undone, and Adrian remained exactly where he was, steady, composed, not because nothing had changed, but because everything had, and for the first time that night, the silence that followed did not feel heavy, it felt earned. The air settled slowly after her footsteps faded, not with relief, but with a kind of quiet clarity that lingered in every corner of the room, and for a moment, no one spoke, as if the entire space had agreed, without words, to acknowledge what had just unfolded, and Adrian remained still, his posture unchanged, but the weight he carried was no longer the same, because what had been taken from him earlier in the night had not been his dignity, it had been an illusion, and now that illusion was gone, stripped clean in front of an audience that had expected him to fall with it, but instead, they had watched him remain, not untouched, but unbroken, and Naomi stood beside him, not closer than before, not farther away, her presence unchanged in a way that now felt intentional, as if she understood that what mattered was not proximity, but consistency, and Adrian turned his head slightly, not toward the room, not toward the door, but toward her, and there was something different in his expression now, not just recognition, but decision, something that carried weight beyond the moment itself, and his voice, when it came, was quiet, controlled, but carried across the table with unmistakable certainty. "You did not step away," he said, not as a question, but as a statement that held more meaning than the words themselves, and Naomi met his gaze, her answer just as simple, just as steady, "No," she said. And the space between them held that truth for a second longer than necessary, allowing it to settle into something real, something that did not need to be explained or justified, and Adrian nodded once, a small motion, but deliberate, as if confirming something within himself, and then he shifted his attention outward, not scanning the room, not reclaiming dominance in the way he once would have, but acknowledging the presence of those who had witnessed the moment, and without raising his voice, without standing, without needing to command attention, he spoke. Again, the words measured, calm, and final. "We are leaving," he said, not to Naomi, not to the room, but as a quiet declaration of movement, of choice, of control that no longer depended on perception, and Naomi understood immediately, stepping behind him without hesitation, her hands resting lightly on the handles of the wheelchair, not as an act of service, but as a continuation of presence. And as she began to guide him forward, the soft sound of the wheels against marble carried through the silence, steady, unhurried, and every eye followed them, not out of curiosity now, but out of something closer to respect, because what they were witnessing was not power in its loudest form, but in its most undeniable one, the kind that does not need to prove itself to exist, and as they moved through the dining room, past the tables, past the people who had once whispered, past the place where the night had nearly broken into something smaller, something lesser, the atmosphere shifted completely, no longer watching a man defined by what he had lost, but recognizing one who had chosen what he would not lose, and Naomi did not look around, did not acknowledge the attention, her focus steady, her movement smooth, as if the path ahead mattered more than anything left behind, and when they reached the entrance, the door opening with a quiet ease that mirrored the moment itself, Adrian paused for just a fraction of a second, not turning back, not hesitating, but allowing the silence behind him to settle fully into what it had become, and then they moved forward, out into the night air that felt cooler, clearer, untouched by what had happened inside, and as the door closed behind them, the room they left behind remained still for a moment longer than usual, not because they were gone, but because something had been left in their place, something that would not fade quickly, something that had nothing to do with wealth or status, but everything to do with presence, and that night, no one remembered the man who had been abandoned, they remembered the moment he chose not to be, and the woman who never treated him as anything less than whole, and in that quiet, undeniable way. The world had been reminded of something it too often forgot, that dignity does not disappear when it is tested, it reveals itself.